My answer is Snickers and probably Skittles, thinking of those who can't or don't eat chocolates. And I might snag a Snickers bar for myself too. So I'm KDC. I'm the TAB lead here. So that's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Provider. And we're based here at WVU in Morgantown, but we have partners throughout the region, including Virginia Tech, Marshall University, and University of Delaware. And so my background is in city and county planning, but I've been here for about 3 years now in the great field of brownfield. So we appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to hand it over to Seth to introduce himself.
Sorry, my mute button was hidden. Hello, everyone. I'm Seth Cardwell. I'm the Community Development Associate on the team. I have been here for a little over, well, almost a year and a half at this point, I guess. So I can't say a little over a year anymore. I graduated in May of 2023 from WVU. My background is in public administration.
Thanks, Seth. All right, so just a quick overview of Mid-Atlantic TAB. Again, we provide assistance for all of your brownfield needs and questions throughout EPA Region 3, and that includes Virginia. And there are many ways that we can provide assistance to you, and one of those includes brownfield education, such as today's webinar. Would like to give Christian and Karen the opportunity to introduce themselves because they are the stars of today's webinar.
Good morning. My name is Christian Smith. I'm the Region 3 Senior Projects Officer here in Brownfields. I am also the Virginia State Lead, and I am also the TBA Coordinator for the region. So if you have any questions about those, please feel free to reach out to me.
And I'm Karen Weber. I'm with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I'm the State Brownfields Coordinator. I also work on VRP projects, and I have been in this role now for just about 2 years, and with DEQ for 2.5 years, with 19 years of environmental consulting leading up to that. I do think we need to address the person who put pierogies in their comment. I'm sorry, and it's pierogi is also the plural. I said pierogies. I love pierogi, so I will be at your house dressed up however I need to be. So I am also part of the committee that's on the Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund grant review that is run through the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. I bring that up because sometimes EPA grants and VBAF grants can play well together. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Karen. All right, so we want to let you know that it is our intention for today's webinar to serve as a part 2 webinar about information for the EPA Brownfield grants. Part 1 we hosted in August, and you can find the recording here on the slide. Following today's webinar, Becca will send out an email that includes a recording of the webinar as well as slides, so you will be able to click a link on this. And that particular webinar gives a deeper dive into the types of EPA Brownfield grants and what the eligible activities are. So really encourage you to take a look at that, because that together with today's webinar is really going to help you paint a bigger or see the bigger picture and understand the process a little bit better. But again, today is all about learning more about changes from last year's grant application round to this year. And then also Karen is going to take the time to make sure you are clear on the requirements for the Virginia DEQ. This particular slide just hits the highlights of the agenda, what you can expect to hear about today. And coming up, that includes an overview of the brownfield grants as well as eligibility, sam.gov, and the application for threshold criteria. This year's grant changes, and that does exclude the multi-purpose grant for this year. Grant package information, some key information, as well as resources and the opportunity to ask questions. If you do have questions, Becca just provided that in the chat. Feel free to put them into the chat and we will take the opportunity to answer them throughout the presentation. And we've also included a couple of breaks throughout the webinar. So moving on, I'd like to turn it over to Christian. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, good morning again, everyone. I'm going to start my portion of the presentation by apologizing. It's going to be very dense and there's a lot of acronyms, so I'll try and explain them all. But to start off, I'll give you an overview of our grant program, and then the first two acronyms you're going to hear are MARC and ARC. These stand for Multi-Purpose Assessment, Revolving Loan Funds, and Cleanup Grants. These are the main grants that we offer. They're not all offered every year. So for example, this go around, we're not offering the multi-purpose grants. That's why the competition you might hear referred to as ARC, A-R-C. That's the Assessment Revolving Loan Fund, RLF, or the cleanup grants. Next slide, please. This is a brief timeline of the events to come. It's subject to change every year. It's kind of dependent upon our headquarters, the request and when the reviews are completed and all that. So we've got a rough timeline of the month you can expect to see things. Your application is due November 14th. That's a hard deadline. You have to submit that through grants.gov. Please make sure to double check all of your work. We'll go into what you should include in your package in this presentation a little bit, but just know that we can't add anything to your application past November 14th. We might reach out to you for clarification, but we can't make any, changes. If you mess up, a digit in your budget or something like that, or, you mess up an address or something else like that, we can't change that for you. So please just double check. That could, potentially disqualify you. So then, our headquarters will review the applications. They do an initial threshold review, and this is just making sure, you submit everything that you need it, that you have a complete application. Once that happens, it comes to the region in the December-January timeframe, and we do a threshold eligibility review. We're going through things. We're checking to make sure you're an eligible entity. If you have a previous assessment grant or multi-purpose grant, or a brownfields grant, I should say, we're looking to make sure you have at least a 70% drawdown, which is required in order to apply for another brownfields grant. So it's things like that. It's a lot of yes, no questions. It's, it's a pass fail sort of thing. After that, we go on to the national panel review. So we'll have a program capability review and then a panel review, which is comprised of 3 people reviewing your application, 1 from within the region, 1 from outside of brownfields, and then another brownfields reviewer from a different region. The idea is to try and eliminate bias here, and we'll average those scores together. Once that's done, we present the scores to our headquarters. They categorize everything, and then based upon when they get all the reviews and they do their analysis, they'll determine, who's going to get funded, what grants are going to be funded for which reason. I think the biggest delay here is not everyone asks for round numbers. I have a slide later on that'll show you what we're offering or what we expect to award. But not everyone asks for nice round numbers like $1 million grant. Some people, they only need $378,000 to, remediate the site. We're not going to give them an extra $700,000 if they don't need it. So based upon that, the number of grants and the dollar value of those grants that we can award always changes from year to year. But we do have a prediction, like I said, later on that I'll show you. And then sometime around the May timeframe is when we'll actually publicly announce who we have selected. We'll also reach out to those that didn't get selected, and we'll let you know, and we'll offer you guys a debrief session if you want. Highly encourage that. I'll touch a little bit on that later, but this is a chance to see where you can improve your application for the next grant award period. Next slide, please. So again, these are what we anticipate offering. I'm not going to go over everything here. You can see it. The length of the grants we're going to award, the dollar amount. So you can see, like at the bottom, the most obvious is you see 3 cleanup grants. We're expecting, we'll award 30 cleanup grants for 500,000, 23 for 2 million. But again, it all depends upon what comes in. If, we get 20 applications for 500,000, we might be able to fund them all. But if we receive, 20 applications for $1 million, we might, only be able to fund half of it. So it all just depends upon the request we receive and the funding that we have available. One thing that I did want to point out, I think is kind of important, is we're distinguishing between new grantees and existing grantees. And that's kind of defined here in the right-hand column. New grantees are those that have not received a grant since 2016 or earlier. So if you have if you received a 2016 grant or a 2015 grant, and this is the next grant that you're applying for this coming around in FY25, you would be considered a new grantee. If you received a grant post 2016, a Brownfields grant post 2016, like let's say 2017, you got an assessment grant, you would be considered an existing Brownfields grantee. And we make this distinction because, you know, we want to spread the love out. We don't want to just be giving grants to the same, you know, community every single time. We want to spread that love out so it, you know, it gets evenly distributed. But at the same time, we don't really want to penalize those for doing a great job. You know, they know how to write their proposals, they follow through with the work, and they continuously get these awards. So we take that into a little bit of consideration when we're reviewing, and that's how we make the distinction between new and existing. And again, this is always subject to changes, posted online, and I believe the slides will be made available for you, so you can get a rough idea of, you know, the amount of funding available. If we could go to the next slide, please. So your eligible entities to apply. So basically, what we're looking for is we're not awarding to private citizens. So we're awarding to state and local tribal governments, general purpose local governments, regional development agencies, nonprofits, quasi-government agencies. I've gotten some questions about this recently, and quasi-government agency is, they're not as common, but it's like an agency that was created by the government, but it's sort of run by private industry, and there's kind of like a joint venture there. So I think one of the biggest examples that I could find was Amtrak. It was created by the government, but it's run privately. So again, with the Brownfields program, we're looking for some sort of public benefit. So that's why these are our eligible entities. We don't want to just award it to, you know, a private citizen to, you know, build their own mansion. Next slide, please. So I won't go over all of this. It's very detailed. This is posted online, but this is just an eligibility chart. If you have an existing grant, and you want to know what you can apply for, the different types of assessment grant, cleanup, you know, community-wide grants, you could follow this chart. You simply go down the left-hand column, you know, you pick out what you have. You have a, let's say you have a RLF grant, you know, third from the bottom. Then you simply go across, and those are all the grants that you could apply for. So where it says yes, you could apply for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, a coalition assessment grant. You would not be eligible to apply for another RLF. Or an RLF as a non-lead member or coalition. So again, this is posted for you guys to look at. You know, it's, you know, everyone's in their own unique situation, so I'm not going to go through everything here. I think one of the biggest things, if you do have a grant, you'll see in yellow here is most of the time you have to have a 70% drawdown on that existing grant to apply for a new grant. So by November 14th, you have to have drawn down 70% of that grant to be eligible to apply for the new one. If you have 69% drawdown on November 14th when you submit your grant, you're immediately going to be disqualified in the threshold review there. And then if we could go to the next slide, I think we have a similar chart, but this is for if you just want to apply for multiple grants. So if you want to, you know, apply for a cleanup, RLF, an assessment grant, you know, maximize your options here. This will show you what you can apply for and receive at the same time. You know, you're welcome to put in multiple applications, but you're not necessarily going to get awarded. You know, it's beneficial for you to pick and choose which one you're going to select, because if you know, submit 2 applications and you can only, you know, you're only eligible to receive one of them, we might pick and choose for you, and it might not be your preference. So take a look at this slide again, just follow down the left-hand column. If that's your, I would say the left-hand column should be your, you know, your primary choice, what you want to get. If you want an RLF grant, you know, follow that across and it'll show you all the others that you can apply for and receive concurrently with that grant. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little about SAM.gov. We can go to the next slide. This is where you're going to, we post the notice of funding opportunity on the site. So this is where you're going to go and you're going to see, you know, the request for funding. We'll talk about, you know, who can apply, the eligible activities, all of that. I highly encourage everyone to go check out this document. It'll outline exactly what you need to include in your application. It even shows you how we're going to score it in the back of the NOFO, the notice for funding opportunity. It'll detail, this section is going to be worth 5 points. This is what you need to include. Some of them have sections where they say, you need to include this and the end is underlined. You need to include this. So if you don't include both items, you're automatically docked a point. So highly encourage you to check this out. You're going to have to sign up with sam.gov if you haven't already. It's completely free. There have been some companies out there sending emails around, scams or whatever, charging you to set this up. Please don't pay for it. This is entirely free. We here at the EPA can help you, and I believe the TAB will help you out too if you need anything. It's a very simple and easy process, but you're going to need to do this. You're going to need to get registered with the system to get it's called a unique entity identifier, UEI number. And this is a requirement to apply for our grants. So again, it's free to do. You simply, log onto the site and I think you submit an application for it. And other than that, you just have to maintain it. So every year you just basically have to go in there and renew your application or whatever it is. It's just like an activity tracker. They don't want, accounts just sitting there and, no one's checking on it. So once a year, you'll have to go in here and just, refresh that and make sure it's active. This has to be active for you to submit your application. It has to be active for us to, our grants team to make the award. And I believe this also has to be active for you to make drawdowns. So again, usually it's good for 1 year and then you have to go back in there and re-up it, a free process. If there's a gap in between you re-upping it, you might not be able to make your, ASAP drawdowns. So sam.gov is, pretty important. It's very free. If you need any help with that, please feel free to reach out to us. There's some basic things that you're going to need to set it up, like your bank routing number. I think all non-federal entities must mail original signed and notarized letter to the Federal Service Desk within 30 days for activation. And then I forget, SAM stands for System for Award Management, FYI, another acronym for you. So yeah, just make sure you get in there, you get registered. I would do this in advance. Again, it might take some time to actually get set up. You can see the bullet point there says, you have to mail something back within 30 days. So just don't wait till November 13th, November 14th to, log in here and try and get set up. I would do this well in advance so that if there are any problems, you can work with us, you can work with the help desk, TAB, whoever it is, to get this straightened out. Because again, you're going to submit your application through sam.gov. It's a very hard requirement that you submit it through here by the deadline. If you're late with, barring any extreme circumstances, your application won't be considered if it doesn't come through sam.gov by the deadline. So now I'll talk a little bit about the threshold criteria that you're going to need to include with your application. So again, the threshold is, kind of us just weeding out the applications, making sure you have everything that we've asked of you that's, called for in the notice of funding opportunity. So again, we're making sure you're an eligible entity that's, eligible to receive this funding. We're looking to see if you have your drawdown, from your previous work. Again, double check your work, any mistakes, if I've had it happen where the work plan didn't match the, required state letter, the site address was different and therefore, their application failed threshold. So just double check. We can reach out to clarification, if something doesn't make sense to us or it sounds ambiguous, but we can't fundamentally alter your application. We can't add anything new. Technically, we're not supposed to look at anything outside of your application, outside of those page limits. So if you include hyperlinks, we're not supposed to click on that. It's supposed to be included within your package. You can include things as attachments, but again, you shouldn't be calling or directing us to go to the web or anything like that, because we're not technically supposed to look at that through the training that we've received. So again, just triple check your work, just make sure everything's there. Get an extra pair of eyes on this. It's always a good idea. And then if your application is deemed ineligible for funding as a result of threshold, we'll notify you within 15 days. So you'll know about that, and we'll also offer you the opportunity for a debrief. Again, that's a great opportunity to see where you lost points. We can, explain how you can boost your application for the following year. So for your assessment grants, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the requirements is your environmental state agency letter acknowledging your application to conduct assessment activities. This is a requirement. I think Karen's going to talk about this later about, the deadlines that's included with that. We realize this is outside of your control, so please, try and get it submitted by the deadline that Karen's going to talk about later on. But if you can't, at least include in your application the request letter that you sent to your state agency. This will serve as a placeholder until we get the actual letter. The actual state letter is a requirement to award the grant, but like I said, we can use that request letter that you sent as a placeholder. We realize that our state agencies do get overwhelmed with these requests this time of year. It is, end of year, there's a lot going on. They're not just, dealing with brownfields grants. So we do allow a little bit of leeway there. So then for your cleanup grants, for your threshold criteria, we're looking to make sure that you have sufficiently characterized the site. In some circumstances, we can do additional characterization, but for the most part, you should know, what you're getting yourself into. We're giving money to remediate the site. We want to know that you've put in your, you've done your homework to make sure you know what you're getting yourself into. You've evaluated, cost and all of this. So we want, you to have a pretty solid, well laid out plan. We don't want to give you money and then you figure it out after the fact. So your work plans are going to be pretty detailed. Your budget will also be a little more detailed than the assessment grants. And you'll also need a determination letter made by the state agency. And this will usually talk about whether the site's eligible to be enrolled in the VRP and why or why not it's, going through or not going through the VRP. And also for a cleanup grant, you need to have a phase 2 environmental assessment completed or equivalent. And this is what, again, characterizes the site for you. Typically, you might need further supplemental assessments after the phase 2, but the phase 2 does a lot of the characterization for you. Next slide, please. So for cleanup grants, you also must be the owner of the site by the time that you apply for the grant. So by November 14th, 2025, you must be the owner of the site to apply for a cleanup grant. If you're not the owner, your application is going to get tossed out during threshold. I think a lot of this has to do with just like site access, and if you're not the owner or the owner backs out or something like that, then what do we do with the grant fund? So that's why we require you to be the owner. And to go along with that, you should have conducted a all appropriate inquiry, AAI. This is typically included within a phase 1 assessment. You should conduct this 180 days prior to transferring the property. So prior to taking ownership of the property, you should have a AAI completed within 180 days. Furthermore, when you apply for a cleanup grant, you should have a phase 1 completed within the last 365 days, so last calendar year. So if you purchased this property, let's say 2 years ago, you should do the phase 1 before you purchase the property. You buy the property, and then maybe 2 years later, you come here and you're like, hey, I want to apply for a cleanup grant. Well, before you apply for the cleanup grant, you should do an updated phase 1 so that you have that within the last calendar year to apply for the grant. So there's kind of 2 requirements. The 180 days, you should do the phase 1 before transferring the property. And then you should have a phase 1 or an updated phase 1 within 365 calendar days of applying for your cleanup grant. And then the owner must not be eligible or liable in any way for the contamination at the site or afflicted with any person potentially liable. So I always give the example, if someone started a landfill in their backyard and they just allowed anyone to come in there, so that they could turn a profit, we're not going to pay for that. They're going to be responsible for the cleanups. various things like that. The one caveat is, building materials back in the day included asbestos material, lead-based paint. That was before we realized that that was, detrimental to human health and their environment. So that wasn't really an at-fault situation. So we don't consider those properties, that to be a responsible party situation.
Hey,
Next slide, please. Yes.
Quick clarification from a question in the chat. So what if you are the owner and operator of a site that you want to get a cleanup grant for? How would you be able to become eligible if you're already the owner?
So a lot of the times what we'll see is, again, projects that come through our program, especially the cleanup grants, should have a pretty, or I don't want to say a solid reuse plan, but there should be some, some plan in the works. We're not just going to award a cleanup grant to, clean up the site for the sake of cleaning it up. We would love to do that if we had the money. We'd love to clean up all these sites, but the fact of the matter is we don't. So we have to pick and choose where we spend the money. Where we spend our money, we actually want it to see, become, a reproductive site. So we kind of have to pick and choose. So there's going to have to be some public benefit to it overall. So if you're just trying to clean up the site for yourself, it's just not going to work out with our program. But if you want to turn it into, a park, or, you're going to turn it into apartment spaces, something like that, where many people can live there, it's going to generate income, maybe you create jobs through the, a building manager or something like that, that would be seen as a public benefit. So something like that, I think that would be your first hurdle, or your first thing to look at. If that's, there's going to be some sort of public benefit. A lot of times what we see is the owner will donate the property or sell the property for like $1 to a redevelopment agency, or, an eligible entity that could apply for the grant. They'll apply for the grant, do the remediation, and then they'll, sell it back to the owner, who will, eventually redevelop the site. So, and you can kind of consider that, like, I think it's leverage dollars maybe. But that's sort of the workaround that we see most of the time. So again, going back to the whole community benefit, our projects are supposed to have a community benefit. We don't want you to, we don't want just one person, coming up with all the decisions. We want you to get the, community buy-in. So, you might think putting in a McDonald's is going to create jobs, is going to be great for everyone, but the community might say, hey, we already have enough fast food. We need medical offices, or we need public transportation. So we actually want to make sure you're providing a benefit to your community. It's actually what they want, what they're going to use. So we require you to hold a public meeting for the cleanup grant. And this is basically to discuss your application, your intentions. We're going to remediate this site, this is what we're going to do with it ultimately. And then you should be collecting public comments on this. Again, if they stand up and say, hey, we don't want this McDonald's, we'd rather have medical facilities, something like this, we'd want you to, we want to see how you're going to include those comments, in some sort of meaningful way. We don't want you to just have a meeting, hey, this is what we're going to do, have them comment, and, it goes into a black hole. So we require you to have this public meeting. It has to be conducted, I believe it's 2 weeks prior to your application deadline. So 14 days prior. So I guess that's November 1st. So by November 1st, you have to have held a public meeting. You have to have publicly advertised for it. So a lot of times this is, ads in newspapers, social media ads, through your websites. You got to put the word out there somehow. You can't just hold a secret meeting. And you got to include this with your application package. So you basically, include we see a lot of newspaper clippings where, you say the town's holding a meeting on this day, every member of the public's welcome to come and comment. They include an attendance sheet, and then any comments, and then, how they were, potentially incorporated or responded to. So you should include that with your cleanup application as well. This is another common pitfall that we sometimes see. This is a hard threshold pass. If you held your community meeting on November 2nd, that's 13 days prior to the submission deadline. So you would, immediately fail the threshold, because it has to be 14 days. So please just make sure you hold your meetings, and disseminate the information. Next slide, please. So again, I think I already mentioned this, but you gotta, put the word out there, get it out there publicly that you're going to hold this meeting. A lot of times, again, local newspapers, the radio, there's many different ways that you can do this. There's no hard requirement, but most people do, a couple different sources, whatever works for your community. You should know your community, how they communicate, if it's word of mouth, newspapers, whatever, email, you're free to determine what that is, but you should put that out there. And again, you're supposed to include some sort of proof of that. So a lot of times it's a newspaper clipping. So in your notification, you should still clearly state that you're applying for this grant. You should include your APCA, which is your Alternative Brownfields Cleanup Analysis. And this is basically just looking at a couple different options. If we continue with the status quo, what's that look like? If we remediate the site, what's that look like? And then, usually there's some third sort of option to kind of consider. And that way you can see the sort of, the prioritization of this site, how serious it is and things like that. So you should make that available for the public. Again, so that you can show like maybe the McDonald's isn't the best, maybe you consider a medical office too, or whatever. And again, it should be available for review and comment. If the public, has some sort of meaningful comment, you should, include that in your application. Again, it shouldn't just fall on deaf ears. And yeah, you should have your application. Most people post their application on their website or, in the town hall, the library, wherever. So next slide, please. So these next two slides, I believe, are infographics. I'm not going to go over them entirely. I know they're a little hard to see, but these go over some threshold criteria for cleanup and assessment grants. So this one is for cleanup grants. I know it talks a lot about property ownership. And then obviously everything in this world is not black and white. So there are some exceptions. We talk about that here to CERCLA. So Indian tribes, Alaskan Native corporations, a town that, received a property through foreclosure or abandonment or something like that, they're, exempt. We're not going to come after you if somebody else defaulted and you just inherited this property. So there are some exceptions, and you can find that here. Like I said, it's available on these slides, and we also have this posted online. We'll talk about the community notification and all that, and then yeah, the petroleum eligibility. What did I want to say here? The eligibility. So petroleum is the bigger one. I know there's some confusion. We can assess petroleum sites, but a lot of the times petroleum generators or petroleum tanks, they're registered with the state. So there's usually just one extra step where we just have you, submit a request to the state to see whether there's a record of any release or potentially responsible parties. Not every hazardous substance is necessarily registered with the state, but so that's why we have you checking with the state for petroleum sites. It's just one additional step, but we can assess petroleum sites. Next slide. And again, this is just more, I think I covered most of this, some threshold criteria for assessment grants. You just have to be an eligible entity. You have to have your, your drawdown. You should, again, be including the community in your, in your work plan, and you should allow them to comment, make sure, you're actually going to be doing things in the community that they want to see done, that they're going to use. So things like that. Again, we're looking to make sure that, these sites become some sort of public benefit, they help the community and not just one person. So again, a lot of people hold like monthly meetings with their community to just keep them abreast of what's going on. Next slide. So now I'll go over some of the changes with this year in the ARC competition. And again, the ARC is the assessment, RLF, and cleanup grants. So right up front, we have, when you get these slides, you can find a list of all the changes here in the grant guidelines. And then on the next slide, I believe we'll go into some of the specifics. So some of the specifics for assessment grants. So this year, for coalition grants, the threshold criteria requirement that prohibited non-lead coalition members from having an open MARC grant or a MARC grant that has closed in the last 7 years has been removed. So you must have at least one non-lead member that has never been awarded a Brownfields grant. And you also must, again, have that 70% drawdown. You'll see that's kind of a recurring theme for most of these. And then applicants may still be eligible for community-based nonprofit organizations as non-lead members. So I know coalitions can be a little wordy sometimes, a little confusing. I know we have a page dedicated to this. I would recommend checking that out if you're interested in coalition grants. And then, as always, with just any grants, I'd recommend going back to those previous charts and just, going down the columns to make sure you can apply. It goes over some of the, requirements of what you need, such as, a coalition member that's never been awarded a grant, things like that. Next slide. So the revolving loan fund, I don't think there was too many changes. I think it was really just in the ranking and evaluation, like some of the scoring criteria. I don't think we fundamentally altered, anything that we're requiring of you. But if you want to check out some of those like scoring changes and things like that, we have a link here for that. And then we'll go through the changes to the cleanup grants. So I don't think there's really a change, but we're kind of more so promoting it. Again, asbestos and lead-based paint. These were kind of like common building materials back in the day before we, really found out that these were detrimental to human health and the environment. So we don't really see these as like at fault situations. We don't really consider those owners responsible parties. So if you have a site that is contaminated with asbestos or lead-based paint, there's a good chance that, and it's an older building, the caveat is if for some reason you built a hotel in 2020 and you use lead-based paint and asbestos, you're probably going to be found as the responsible party. But if it's like an older buildings from like the 80s, 70s, whatever, from that time period, chances are we're not going to consider you a responsible party and you are eligible to apply for a cleanup grant. I think we've just made that a little more pronounced in our NOFO or notice for funding opportunity, because this has always been an eligible activity. I think there's just been some confusion around it. I know with assessment grants, you can assess these sites, but you can't do, abatement. We can do abatement design, but not the actual abatement. Next slide, please. I guess that's time for questions. Does anyone have any questions for me?
Yeah, so another clarification question. So with the cleanup grants and not currently being the owner, would they be able to transfer the property to an industrial development authority?
Yes, we would just recommend, do that phase one before you transfer the property. The phase one basically looks at the site and says, hey, there's contamination here. We're making that aware to you before you purchase the property. And therefore, as long as you don't, exacerbate the contamination, you don't add to it, you make reasonable steps, or you take reasonable steps to prevent the further spread of that contamination, you're not going to be seen as liable for the contamination at that site once you take ownership. So that's what the phase one all appropriate inquiries will do for you. So we highly recommend you complete that. Like I said, it is a requirement for the cleanup grants. So if you, purchase the property and you don't have that phase one, you might not pass the threshold criteria here.
Thank you. Another question, would churches qualify for grants?
Good question. I think they potentially could, because nonprofits are eligible. I think we would just have to look at the structure of how your organization's set up. I think that would be eligible.
All right, that's all the questions in the chat right now.
Okay, I think I'm going to turn it over to Karen Weber at this point, right?
Yeah, give you a break to get a drink of water or something. So, once you get into completing the application, I like to say it's not unlike putting together a piece of IKEA furniture. You can try to put it together without following the instructions, but it's risky, and you may end up with random pieces that are actually very important to the whole of the piece that you're building. You don't want to leave anything out on your grant application. The easiest thing to do is follow the instructions, and once you put it together, make sure you go back and can check off that you have completed all of the pieces that are necessary. That's will lead towards a more successful grant application. When looking at the pieces, being succinct, being concise, but also telling your story can be a bit of a challenge. So when you're doing your project description, your plans for revitalization, you do want to tell the story and lay the foundation of what you plan to do. I think it's really important to identify your community needs and how you intend to engage with the community, as well as providing the specific information, the data, your cost estimates, and how you measure progress. If you set the stage for that, this is a do as I say, not as I do piece of this slide. How you stay on track, how you're going to measure the progress throughout the grant, set the stage for that, and it will help you be successful once awarded as well. But there are some criteria that are defined in the grant, your routine reporting, processes like that. But you need to internally also be able to gauge how you're going to work through the whole of the grant, so you don't come to the end and have an excess of funds or get started too early and not be able to kickstart anything. As well as identifying your ability to manage the grant. It is not unmanageable, but these are, they take time and they take effort to manage the grant throughout. And it's important to set the stage again for your ability to manage the grant and be clear on how you're going to do that. EPA wants to know that you'll be successful once awarded. I think we've already talked about threshold criteria, and any additional information that you can fit. Stay in the page limit, stay in the word limit. They will not review beyond. This is not a VBAF grant, is different. We will take more than 100 words, but here you really have to be concise. If you're using Word, it should tell you your word count. These things are, and how it fits on the page. Next slide. These are just some of the basics, making sure that you are checking the boxes and filling in the information and being clear. A lot of this information will, the location, the funding request, how much you're asking for, your target areas. That is also information that we would like to see in our letter request for support. This is kind of an acknowledgement and support letter that we provide that says we are aware of what the ask is. We are aware of the community need. We are aware of the projects, and we support this effort and the funding from EPA. I think it's also an opportunity to connect with DEQ. We can be a part of your outreach with the community. We can help walk through eligible sites and tasks that may be needed. We work very closely with EPA Region 3, especially Christian, and the TAB group in West Virginia. So having that dialogue is really important, and we're here to help with that. So when you send, I think next slide is fine. Go ahead. The letter, the support letter, we call it acknowledgement and support. We are acknowledging that you are asking for this grant from EPA. We are in support of your effort, and that is based on the information you gave us of what you want to do and what you're asking for. We are asking for about a week turnaround time. If you can submit those by November 5th, we will be able to get it to you. If you are running late and you ask us last minute, we will do our best to turn it around right away. We're not going to deny you. We're not going to say no. But this just allows us to manage workload or if somebody's out. I'm not the only one working on these. Right now I have 4 that have come in. So we will take them as we go. We are logging them and send back the letter, as quickly as possible. As Christian noted, for some of these, if it comes after, that's not going to hold up the grant, but they will want to see it as part of the package to be awarded. Next slide. So the basic letter, acknowledgement and support, was for assessment and RLF grants. The cleanup grants, it's a little bit different. So we do need more time. And for these, we go through kind of an eligibility determination and say, is the site eligible for VRP, which is Voluntary Remediation Program enrollment? We would include a letter. That means we need to take the time to look at those eligibility criteria. When we get a VRP application in, we send it to our petroleum group, we send it to our solid waste group and our RCRA group, and we have them look and say, is there another regulatory control over this site that might preclude eligibility in VRP? If we identify something like that, we will communicate it with you right away. We will talk about it and figure out what it means for this grant. It doesn't happen often. So we're going to go through that process, and that takes a little more time. I can't just take the letter and turn it around right away. I have to go through that process, which means touching with other people. We're going to look at the data. So send us what you have. Send us, I don't need a full report, but just say, we've done this environmental site assessment. I might ask for some details associated with that, some mapping, some summaries. We're going to help look at that from a technical perspective. There are times when a site is not eligible for VRP enrollment, or we wouldn't require it. That tends to be sites that have an asbestos abatement condition. Those are the typical not eligible for VRP or not necessary to enroll in VRP. And the letter would state that as well. So an asbestos abatement site, we might still go through some of these steps for under that eligibility criteria, make sure there isn't something else associated with the site that has been overlooked. But our letter would generally say it's not eligible for VRP enrollment. However, it still meets the criteria for this cleanup grant, and we still support that. That's our role in these. And that's all I have.
Okay, so I'll talk about some of the key information that you're going to need to submit with your application. We have all these forms posted online. So the first one's your SF424. This is the application for federal assistance. This will talk a little bit about your organization, your UEI number, points of contact, what districts, things like that. And then it also includes a little bit about the funding. I should also mention that throughout all of these documents, you should ensure that they're all consistent. So, if you're talking about the budget, you should make sure that your total budget matches from document to document. We've seen it where it happens, you're working on multiple documents at a time, and maybe just the version control or whatever, one, slightly differs from the other. And the grants team won't be, able to award that. So we'll work with you later on once you're selected for that. But yeah, so the next one that you're going to need is your 424A, your SF424A. This is your budget detail. I think it's 3 pages long. It almost, 3 pages saying the same thing in 3 different ways. But it's a required form. It's relatively easy. If you need help filling it out, we can, help you with that. Your key contacts form, the 5700-54. This is going to, list out who's your authorized representative, who your payee is, all the points of contact that we need to get, set up, who's going to be the project manager that we're going to communicate, who should be, getting the invoices about getting set up in ASAP, our payment system, things like that. There's a pre-award compliance form. I believe this is a checklist. It's relatively easy. It asks you about your organizations, certain policies, you have them posted, things like that. So again, this is posted online. Check out the form. It's, and just follow through with that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And then obviously you're going to need to include your project narrative statement. So this is essentially where you detail what you plan to do with the grant funds. It includes a little history of the site, and then what your next steps are going forward. Again, all of these should be submitted with your application. It's detailed on sam.gov in the NOFO. And yes, you should be submitting these through sam.gov before the deadline. After the deadline, we might work with you via email, but initially you're going to be working with all through sam.gov. And then obviously if you've received a previous grant, or in the past you got a grant debrief, we'd obviously recommend that you include those concepts, what you've discussed with the project officer during your debrief, into your new application. And then obviously if you're unsuccessful this year, we highly encourage you to take us up on our offer to give you a grant debrief. I'd say at least half of our grant applications last year didn't take advantage of the grant debrief. They were just happy, being notified that they weren't selected. So we always recommend it. It's definitely, helpful. You don't know what you don't know until someone points it out. You might think you fully covered a section, but it might not meet what we're looking for. And, us pointing it out to you could make all the difference for next year's application. So very beneficial. Highly recommend grant debriefs. And then when in doubt, check the FAQs. We have every year we publish a FAQ for our, to go along with our notice of funding opportunity, and we post that online. So I highly recommend you check that out. Honestly, whenever I receive a question from a grantee or applicant, this is always my first stop. There's a lot of really good information in there. You can look at the table of contents. It has, lists of questions. Who can apply for this? What are eligible activities that I completed? It even details some ineligible activities, ineligible entities, things like that. So there's a lot of really good information in there. I highly recommend checking it out. I believe even in the table of contents, you can click on the questions, who is an eligible entity. You can click on that and it jumps you right down to there. And then very, very beneficial, at least I think, is in the back of it. It details, exactly the sections that we want to see in your application, and it'll tell you how we're going to score each point. Each section. This section might be worth 5 points. This section might be worth 10 points. Again, highly recommend that you double check the prompt and the criteria, because some of the criteria says, the applicant must include this and this, and therefore if you only include one, you only get, you might get docked a point for only including one. So when in doubt, check your FAQs. Are there any other questions?
There are none currently in the chat, but we can move on to our next section, just in case any questions come up before the webinar ends. So if you're typing something out, keep typing. We will get to your question. I am also going to launch a poll, since TAB is grant funded. We do have some requirements, and it would be very helpful if you could answer at least the first question for the poll that just popped up. How prepared do you feel to write an EPA Brownfields Grant application after receiving support and resources? And then the second question, what other topics or activities would you like to see included in future TAB events? And I'm going to let that run for a minute or two while we talk some more about what resources TAB can provide. Katie, is this one you?
Thanks. Thanks, Becca and Christian and Karen. We really appreciate it. So we just want to give you a quick overview and reminder of how we can help you. Mid-Atlantic TAB can help all throughout the year with your grant process, but in particular in this grant season, we can help you with grant writing assistance. We cannot write your grant, but we are happy to help if you need some support in trying to craft certain elements of your actual application, and we are happy to review it. Just reach out to us and we would be happy to be another set of eyes for you for that review. So again, we're available all year long. There's never any cost for any of the assistance we provide. We just want you to know that it's available, and just want to provide a reminder of the important deadlines that were discussed today. If you would like TAB to be another reviewer for your grant application, we do ask that you submit that to us by November 1st, so we have enough time to turn it around and you can adjust based on feedback that you receive. Karen provided the deadline for the DEQ in here. Please submit a letter request to them no later than November 1st or 5th, but do submit it earlier for a cleanup grant because it is a bit more involved. And of course, the big deadline is November 14th for the actual grant application. And as Christian discussed, it's very important that you are set to actually submit your application, not just for the application itself, but for the actual setup with sam.gov and grants.gov. Do not wait until the last minute, and we are also available to help if you have any questions on that. And just a reminder of how you can get in touch with Karen and Christian. Christian is limited in what he can help with, while the actual grant application solicitation phase is open right now. But he is a great resource. Keep him in mind for any of your other brownfield questions, and certainly Karen, please reach out to her. There's their information as well as our information at TAB. Again, you are going to get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation so you can refer back to this and click on the links to take you to the various sites that we've referenced throughout the webinar.